things that try and meld science and faith issues, and they were interested in trying to get more science into seminary schools. And so we came up with a course with Mark's help as well to try and think about behavior and just sort of the biology of behavior, but then also Mark's piece of it is to try and think a little bit about what are the theological implications of that behavior. And so what I thought I'd do today is sort of a trial run of what that might look like. I haven't taught a course like this before. I've taught animal behavior courses before, but this will be a little different. And one of the things that, well, my perspective on animal behavior is the sort of evolutionary perspective, where you're thinking about what are the what's the adaptive significance of a behavior? How does that behavior affect survival and reproduction for an organism? And that is sort of in contrast to other people who look at behavior from more like a neurological mechanism perspective, or a physiological perspective, or developmental perspective, or learning. Mine is more of the evolutionary ecology side of behavior. And so my plan in the class is to basically go through talking about different types of behaviors and their the survival and reproduction benefits of these different behaviors, costs and benefits, that is. And then what I like to do in my classes when I talk about behavior is then have the students think about, all right, so we are evolved organisms as well. We are animals as well. We are related to all these other critters that I'm talking about as well. And does this apply to us at all? Do you see this in our lives, in our interactions at all, and the way we behave at all? And so try and bring the students to think about themselves and how they relate to animal behavior in the terms that we're learning. And then Mark brings in the piece of, all right, so what do we do with that then? If this does apply to us in some way, what do we do with that? How does that impact the way we think about Christianity in specifically? So anyway, you all are guinea pigs today, and you all are also here as hopefully to maybe generate a little interest in the course too. It is, I think it's an elective for the. Tell me the specifics on who it's for.
So the target has to include seminarians, but
right.
Not only seminarians. But for seminarians, it is one way that they can be part of the Catholic Studies requirement. So Catholic Studies, it requires some philosophy courses, some theology courses, and 2 courses seated in other disciplines, studying things Catholic. So we expanded a little bit and said, hey, if we have a course that's a science class, that also has a theological perspective, at the same time, we're going to say that is the purpose of a Catholic Studies course, and actually we hope that we can continue pushing it to the seminarians. Templeton really is trying to get that clergy would know more about and be more conversant in science.
Yeah.
And thinking about how those two intersect in some positive way. So
yeah. So these students will have already taken, most likely, my Bio 202 class, which is a majors, right? Which is a majors.
So what's the prereq for this, David?
So it's either 151, the general bio class that's a Gen Ed, or it's Bio 202, which as of this year is a Gen Ed class as well. So Bio 202 is titled Evolution and Ecology. And so if they've taken that class, they've gotten a pretty good background in the theory of evolution, and so they're coming in with some background. This is a 300 level class.
It's on the 2-year cycle, is that right, Dave? Or is it every
yeah,
year?
So this is every other year,
right.
Spring. Yeah, spring evens, I guess. So Led Zeppelin effect is communication breakdown. This is a song from Led Zeppelin anyway. That's where my title comes from. Communication breakdown is where if you don't have some sort of honesty in communication, then, oh, we all know about this, don't we? Communication breakdown. This is the last year of our lives here. Where if you don't have some sort of honesty in communication, it's not communication anymore, right? And so what I'll introduce today is just what is communication, thinking about it from an animal behavior perspective, and what are some ideas as to what might maintain honesty in communication in the animal kingdom, and what about us? What about us? Does this apply to us in any way as well? So, an example of communication, here's a real cool, unique example of communication, pretty complex communication. Let's see if this actually works here. All right, we'll say it's trusted. Oh, good. All right, so that's a bad start here.
Remove your head.
Oh, okay.
It's always technology. That's the issue here.
Your browser's out.
Annoying. Come on now, let me select it. You can do it. Yes.
What happens if you put it in the regular mode? So if you go,
What's the regular mode?
That's what he's doing. He's just going to use it in a different platform.
Yeah. So this is the waggle dance in a honeybee. This individual here that's dancing around has found, has found food and is now communicating to the rest of the hive here. Whoa, what's going on here? Communicating to the rest of the hive what direction that food is in and how far away that food is from the hive. These guys are all hanging out watching this display. The direction that he moves in the hive, or she moves in the hive, is telling the other bees what direction to go from the angle of the sun to find that food, and how long they waggle back and forth there gives the other bees an indication how far away it is. So it actually works out to be about, for every second that they waggle, it's about 1 kilometer away. So wow. Anyway, it's really cool stuff. You could watch these all day long with little bees waggling and telling the other bees where their food supply is. And I love YouTube that just keeps going and going, which sometimes in class is not a good thing. It just goes on to the next one and you don't know what the next one is. I planned on the first one, not the next one. Anyway, so within a communication, you've got a sender, the person that's communicating, you've got a signal, that's the thing that's being the medium of communication, and then the receiver is the individuals that are receiving that communication. So other example, kind of cool example here are these vervet monkeys. Vervets give alarm calls. Lots of species do this where they'll yell out when they see some potential predator out there. Vervets are a bit more complex. They actually will yell out the name of that predator. They have different calls for different predators. So if a cheetah is nearby, they'll make one noise. If a hawk or an avian predator is nearby, they'll make another noise. If a snake is nearby, they'll make a third noise. And the graph here is basically saying that when the researchers play back these calls for the vervets, and they play back the cheetah call, most of the vervets, they'll run into a tree. They'll get up high. If they play back the avian predator vervet call, the vervets will either get into cover, get underneath something, or they'll look up, try and figure out where that avian predator is. And if they play back the snake call, then the other vervets that hear that call will start looking around on the ground for a snake. So communication, they're communicating where or what is a potential threat. And so if you think about those last two, you've got the sender, you've got the receiver, you've got the signal there. Everybody's happy. It all works out really well because they all want the same thing. They're all going for they have the same end in mind, right? Whereas these guys, now you've got Peacock, you've got Peahen, and he wants to mate with her, and she may or may not want to mate with him, right? She wants to have the best genes for her offspring. He wants to convince her that he has the best genes, right? He wants to manipulate her through his communication, and she wants to, well, sort of be a mind reader here and figure out, all right, so what of this, what can I gain from this communication that's real, that will actually help me in my reproduction or my survival? So these guys might be a little bit at odds with each other. Right? And so rather than thinking of sender and receiver, you might think of manipulator and mind reader. And you still have this signal in the middle. What you've got here is an arms race. It's an arms race between manipulators here trying to sell the used car, and the receivers here, or the mind readers here. They're trying to figure out, what is there really something good about this car or not? And try and filter out this signal from the noise here. Another example, we've got Redwinged Blackbirds here again, two males. This male here is displaying his bright red epaulets. He's yelling out "Kokorea!" And he's telling the other males that, hey, I'm a really studly male, and you should stay away from me because this is my territory, and you should stay away. And the way the other males assess each other is by looking at these red patches. It's a Redwinged Blackbird. If you look at the red patches, and the size of that red patch actually gives this male here an indication as to what size territory this guy here should be given. And you might think, well, why? Why not just grow a couple extra red feathers? How hard is that? Grow a couple extra red feathers and you automatically get a larger territory, right? Why not cheat? Why not cheat on these things? If you're at odds with the person that you're communicating with, why not be a little deceptive here? Grow a couple extra red feathers, you get a larger territory. That way, perhaps you might get a couple extra females that'll hang out in your territory. You're going to have more offspring that make it into the next generation. Why honesty? What maintains honesty? Let's go through a couple possibilities here as to what might maintain honesty out in the animal kingdom. In some cases, if the interests of the sender and receiver are congruent, then there's no reason why the sender should be dishonest. There's no pressure, no evolutionary pressure, no selection pressure on being deceptive. So the honeybee example, right? This honeybee that's doing the waggle dance here is surrounded by sisters. These are all females that are out there grabbing their food. They're surrounded by sisters, and thanks to the weird genetics of these guys, you're 75% the same as your sister. Whereas in us, right, you and your brother are about 50%, have a 50-50 shot of having the same genes, essentially, right? Whereas these guys, they've got a 75% chance of having this waggle communication gene. And so if your waggle communication gene helps others with that waggle communication gene to survive and reproduce, then, well, you should see that increase in the next generation, right? You're not being altruistic here. You are just helping pass on that gene to the next generation because everybody surrounding you's got that gene as well, right? Same deal with these guys here. We've got these ground squirrels here. Billings ground squirrels, real famous. Lots of study has been done on the alarm calls of these ground squirrels. Kind of like the vervet monkeys. They see a predator, they scream out. And you would think that that's a bad idea, right? You see a predator, why would you make noise? Just run away. Get out of there, right? But he makes noise instead. And he does that. Once again, it's communication, potentially drawing a predator to himself, but communication because he's surrounded by kin. He's surrounded by other individuals that likely have that gene for yelling out because they are mostly him as well, right? They're at least 50% him if they're brothers and sisters or parents. So, and the cost of yelling out is really not that much. Here's kind of an odd one here. Why dress up like a candy as a toad or a frog here? This is a poison dart frog. If you've ever seen these things in real life, they're just unreal. I mean, literally, they just look unreal. They look like they're made out of plastic or something because the colors are just amazing for these things. This is communication as well, right? The coloration here is communicating to predators that I am poisonous, and if you attempt to eat me, you're going to regret it. And predators learn very, very quickly to stay away from things that are, it's called aposematic coloration. Things that are very brightly colored are often poisonous. And the predator doesn't want to eat poisonous things. The prey here does not want to be eaten. So they're both on the same side of that argument as well. Sender and receiver are congruent. But in a lot of cases, the sender and receiver, their intentions, their interests are incongruent. They don't align. That's why I'm going back to manipulator and mind reader here. And so something needs to enforce that honesty. What is it that enforces that honesty? You've got lots of examples of predator and prey, where the predators want to eat them, the prey do not want to be eaten. There's communication there at times. Males and females, like we mentioned with the peacocks and peahens. Parents and offspring. There's often parent-offspring conflict as well, where offspring want everything, parents don't want to give everything necessarily. Male-male competition. Oh, that's these guys here, the two elk that are in competition here for access to females. You can have communication that's taking place. What is it that forces the honesty? Well, a few options here of things that might enforce honesty. One is this idea of an index signal. So this is a way of communicating that you can't really fake. So a good example of that would be that's a great picture. Look at that guy. The toad here, who females choose males based on the depth of their voice. Males that have a deeper voice are more attractive than males that have a higher voice. And it turns out that you can't fake a deeper voice. That this is, in this graph here, you've got snout to vent length, so the size of the toad male versus the frequency of the call. High frequency calls come from small males. Low frequency calls come from big males, right? The bigger you are, the deeper your voice when you're a toad. And so you can't fake being a big toad. And females, maybe they're choosing big toads because those are males that have been around for a while. They're obviously good at surviving, so if you want good genes for your offspring, choose a guy that's been around for a while. That proves it. Same deal with this guy here. Same study, looking at the length of the vocal apparatus there affects the depth of the pitch coming from the elk as well. That has a little bit to do with female choice, but more to do with male-male competition. The males assess each other based on the depth of that bugling call that the male gives, but also the forcefulness of it and how long they can last doing this bugling call. So they'll stand, a half mile apart from each other, two males bugling back and forth, assessing each other. And if I can assess from a half mile away that you're bigger than me and you're going to win, there's no point in me going up there with my daggers on top of my head here and getting myself hurt trying to push you out of away from your harem. So an index signal is one that's impossible to lie. And the same sort of line here, Sometimes people put it in a different category they call direct assessment, but it's sort of a similar idea, things that are difficult to fake. For example, these are terns here, a type of bird that feeds primarily on fish, and they do courtship feeding. So the male will bring food back to the female as part of their courtship. The female's trying to decide whether to mate with this guy or not. And, well, one way of assessing is to see whether he's good at finding food or not, right? If he's good at finding food, then he's going to be good at feeding the offspring in the nest. That's perhaps what she's looking for as well. And that's something you can't really fake, if you're good at finding food or not, right? So if you're able to throw up some really good fish into your mate's mouth, then hey, you're a catch. You're a catch. This is a house finch here. You get these at your feeders here in Indianapolis. And they've got the bright red coloration here. Some males, the red color comes from what they feed on. You can't just produce that stuff. You've got to feed on the right things. You've got to be good at finding food in order to get that red coloration. And so males that have really bright red coloration are a little bit more desirable to females, perhaps because it's an honest indicator of his ability to find food. You want offspring that are good at finding food as well. You want a male that's good at helping you feed the offspring in your nest. These guys here, this is a Blackbirdian warbler. It's, I think it's the most beautiful thing in the world here. They come through Indiana on migration in May and October or so. And what people have found is that males that are more brightly colored in lots of different bird species are more desirable than females. One of the hypotheses to explain that has to do with parasites. And so males that are more resistant to parasites are able to be more brightly colored. The ones that have more parasites, they can't produce that bright coloration. They're not physically able to do it. And so if you want to see, just at a glance, whether the individual that you're going to be hanging out in a nest with and who's going to be, your offspring are going to be hanging out in the nest with is going to bring with them a lot of parasites, well, all you got to do is look at that coloration, and the female can assess whether that guy's going to be resistant or not. So it's communication, and it's something that's difficult to fake without pesticides. Okay, so those last two categories were things that were difficult to fake because they are something that in most of those cases the male can't produce without without having a certain characteristic. This is similar as well, but is an attempt to explain characteristics that seem just really weird. Like, you've got a peacock here, he's got a 10-foot tail. Why in the world would that be a good idea? It just seems like a terrible idea. If you want to get away from predators, if you want your offspring to be good at getting away from predators, why would you mate with some guy that's got a 10-foot tail? You're going to have offspring then with potentially longer tails. That seems like it's a bad idea, right? Why would you do that? Well, the thought is that the cost of the signal here, the cost of having that massive tail, is what maintains the honesty of that signal. And so the idea here is that females are looking at this tail. They're choosing males with the biggest, the brightest, the showiest tails, because only males that are really high quality, really studly males, are the only ones that are going to be able to have one of these tails and live to mate, right? And to be around. And so if you can't handle it, then you're not going to be able to have that big, huge tail. So thinking about in terms of costs and benefits here, got costs and benefits on this axis here, the signal intensity, so tail length on this axis here, a individual that's a really high quality individual here pays less of a cost for having this long tail than a low quality male would, right? If you think about Lauren here, He's yeah. If he if we're what are we doing? We're lifting weights to prove who's the most desirable male here. For him to change from, or to have us, be able to lift a certain amount of weight because he's a high quality male is relatively easy, right? Oh, here's
offset by the high voice tone.
So, for somebody like me to get up to that amount of weight would just be incredibly hard because I don't have the genetics to do it, right? I was also thinking about this guy that just killed me in college. A friend of mine, I was a decathlete in college, and I was just a hack. I was bad. And I trained and trained and trained to get my mile time down. And I went out running with this guy, went as hard as I could. And at the end of the run, he says, "Ah, man, I'm in such terrible shape. I haven't done anything all summer." And I was, I had worked as hard as I could to get to that level, right? He was always better than me at everything, and athletically. And he's this guy here, where the cost of him getting better at something is not that much. Whereas me being this guy here, the cost is much greater for that. And so the signal intensity for me to carry around the big long tail here takes a lot more effort than for Lauren to carry around the big long tail. So lots of really pretty interesting examples of this idea here. One is with Sagegrouse here. These guys, let me show you a quick video here. Maybe? No. Where is it? Sagegrouse are a species that is highly polygynous, so one male mates with multiple females, and the females choose from males to mate with by going to this sort of ceremonial breeding ground where all these males are out here every year in the same spot, and they're dancing out there. They do this dance. They'll do it for a month or so at a time, and for that entire month the males they're on duty. They're out there dancing for at least a few hours a day, looking spectacular as well, showing off their big huge air sacs here and their big tails. And males are competing with each other to be at the center of this lek. This is called a lek. And here's a female. She looks so interested. And the males here who are just killing themselves to be the one chosen to be a sperm donor for the female. And the female, all she does is wanders through, checks out the males, mates with one, wanders off, and that's the end of that encounter here. And lots and lots of studies have been done on this behavior here. There's a cost involved with being out there. There's a cost, an energetic cost to spending a month of your life dancing. And where am I? Here we go, slideshow. Karen, slide. Please, close. And that cost is associated with what that male is communicating, right? He's trying to communicate that, yes, I am a particularly high quality male, that you're going to have pretty, first of all, sexy sons if you mate with me, but then also you're going to have a pretty good chance of having good survivors if you mate with me, because I can put out this massive energy expenditure every day by strutting around over and over and over, and doing it for a month at a time. Okay, well, so that sort of makes sense, right? They're paying a cost. That's ensuring the honesty of that communication. What about this guy here with his red coloration? What's the cost of one feather? People have calculated the cost of having a couple extra feathers. It's not much. And a little bit extra red, yeah, they've got to feed on the right things to get that red, but it's not that big a deal, really. Why not cheat? Again, well, So to test that, that question, what scientists have done is done some paint jobs on these guys and painted some of them a little bit extra red. Oh, they immediately got a little bit bigger territories. But then they got thrashed just over and over. They were getting challenged. So these guys with the biggest red coloration here, that does give them a little bit of extra space right off the bat, but they get challenged on occasion. If you can't back it up, if you can't back up your bright red color here, then you're going to get just thrashed. And so these guys that got painted a little bit extra by the researchers just got beat up and didn't do well. So the cost of having this extra coloration is not necessarily that extra energetic cost of having the feather. It's the cost of getting called on it, right? You have to back it up. And so the cost of fighting is the cost that they're paying. Oh, like this guy here, right? He comes in, pushes the big guy off the stool. If he can't back it up, then it's going to be trouble. All right, so what is he communicating here? Potentially, he's communicating something. Communicating he's pretty wealthy, right? If I come in here and I'm wearing this and I tell you I'm a millionaire, well, you can't really assess that very well. If I come in wearing these guys, 6-carat diamond studs, and my Armani suit, well, you might think, oh yeah, well he might be telling the truth because I had to pay a cost, right? And that cost is associated with what I'm communicating. What about this guy? What is this guy communicating? Idiocy. He's communicating something, right? I mean, you don't buy a pink Hummer if you're not communicating something, right? Perhaps it's the same thing that Kobe is communicating there. This example, I'm just running through these because we're almost out of time. We need a little time to chat. Direct benefit or direct assessment in humans. People are guys that, in this study anyway, guys that do something parental or paternal are more attractive than guys that don't. Guys that walk dogs. If you want to cheat, right? Walk a dog. Oh, I stuck this in here thinking about the lekking display of the sage-grouse, right? All the males are hanging out in the one spot. It's about the size of this room here, dancing out there. Females just wander through and assess those males. What's going on here? All males are hanging out in this one spot, fighting each other for whatever, and the females are around assessing those males, right? Maybe this is lekking in humans. I don't know where this fits in with honesty and communication, but it's interesting, right? Why do people use makeup? Why is it just females essentially that use makeup? All right, here's some of the questions that Mark actually wrote here, and we could talk about these, or we could talk about whatever you are interested in as well. I think first of all, what we've been talking about here is some of the potential explanations for honesty. I'm not sure if I would use the virtue of honesty in that phrase, right, when we're talking about animal behavior, but would use the word virtue of honesty when we're talking about how it applies to us. Do any of these mechanisms apply to us, really, or not? And what examples do you see? How are we different in how we value honesty? Do other organisms value honesty? Is there innate moral worth into being honest, or is it just something that's been put upon us by our biology, right? Christian tradition's link between the character of God and its call for people to be honest, is that necessary? You need that in order for, I think I'm reading your question here right, that do we need that in order to be honest, or is that not necessary? So just some things to think about. Yeah.
I was wondering about, for most of your examples, how they were illustrations of honesty rather than simply something trying to engage in a kind of communication where, so let me back up here. I would think that for something to be an instance of honesty, there has to also be the option of being dishonest. And it didn't seem like in very many of those cases, the option of being dishonest was on the table
Yeah.
for these animals.
Yeah,
So why even call it honesty?
I like that. That's good. What do you think? Yeah.
So aren't there examples, I'm not doing all my comparative biology, but aren't there examples where they're the fake poison animals where they have the right coloring but they're not poisonous?
Yep.
Could you add something like that in to talk about dishonesty?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I toyed with that idea and thought I'd already gone on too long. But yeah, so there's lots of flies that look like bees, right? And that sort of mimicry is all over the animal kingdom, where sort of non-poisonous or non-threatening organisms are riding on the coattails of the threatening ones.
Sure, but
But they
are they
have no
actually
choice.
deciding to do that, or is that just, now that's what they are?
Yeah. So when
Repeating the same things with
Yeah.
like I said.
Yeah, so with all of this, I'm not suggesting that any of these guys are, the Sagegrouse aren't deciding that, hey, I should run to the left and dance all day, every day. It's their sort of evolutionary baggage, right? This is their behavior. And so, I guess one thing I think you're bringing up is that in a lot of cases we have the option of going against our evolutionary instincts, or do we have that option of going against our evolutionary instincts? This is something that I've thought about, that I thought would be interesting in our class to think about, is the idea of sin places where we follow our evolutionary instincts where we shouldn't, or I don't know. It seems like I like your idea. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Bob?
I don't know if I could call mimicry honesty, because the animal has no choice. If it's a green tree frog, it's by the coloration that the mutation caused. But in evolution with us, we're a primate, that's a social group. If we look at other primate social groups, they have done studies. One I'm remembering, and I'm paraphrasing, where a chimp in the social group had gotten food and was supposed to share it and tried to hide it, and the others found out and kind of beat the heck out of them. For a social group survival, and that's what evolution looks at, are you going to have kids? Is honesty a key part of the social group's survival? Or is dishonesty a viable strategy to allow the having of more kids?
Yeah, it's excellent. Excellent thought. So what's the cost of dishonesty in social groups is what?
Well, so let's imagine for the moment that the issue of honesty is biologic,
Mhm.
and an honest social interaction results in the trait, the genome that contributes to honesty is now passed on. And so what you end up with is the next or subsequent generations that behave in such a way that it is for the communal best interest. The dishonest one, however, who is essentially going to fake the interest of the group. When that gene gets passed on, those offspring now are less likely to thrive because they don't have the ability to function for the group collective, and so the cost of faking it is to have that mating and the cost to society of producing the next generation to be completely wasted. So there will at some point be a negative selection pressure against that, and there'll be positive selection pressure in favor of doing it right in the first place.
So I think what you're pointing out is different levels of selection. This gets into
This is not the
evolutionary theory a little bit.
This is not the pure first mating. This is now the F1s
Yeah.
that now don't exhibit the same behaviors that you thought you were going to have. And so F1s or even F2s now behave in a way that is not for that group. And anybody that associates with them is now less likely to thrive, more likely to be prey. And so that original cost, the opportunity of faking it and producing offspring is now offset by the enormous cost to that society.
Yeah, right. So you can have selection on the level of the individual, but you could also potentially have selection on the level of a group if you have a species that has really strong group dynamics. And so if it causes the breakdown of the group, then it causes the breakdown of that.
And those genes then get removed from the population.
Exactly. Good, I like that. Good. Yeah.
Do you think of these animals as self-conscious? The reason I ask that is
yeah,
it seems to me that would be a level on top of, as it were, if you think of consciousness, self-consciousness that way, that would open up, if honesty presupposes a choice, would open that up. The other thing I was curious about, to go down this road, is what does evolution say about the groups themselves? Are the congruent communicators, so to speak, first in the evolutionary chart? Are they later, earlier? You see what I'm getting at? In other words, what's their relationship to one another? Does that make sense?
Well, I have a feeling of what you might be asking. I guess the first question I think you asked, or I thought you brought up, about self-conscious. This is good because I haven't thought of, in my way of thinking about honesty, I'm not thinking about a choice that these guys have, that these, a bird has or an insect has or whatever, to be dishonest. Mm-hmm. And I see that the way some of you are defining honesty, there must be some choice there, or else you can't really define it as honesty or dishonesty. Us animal behaviorists don't put that into the equation, right? We define it as this is communication that is effective or is telling the accurate. Okay, there you go, good. Versus a communication that's inaccurate. Right. Okay. So maybe we could just use those different terms, and that would help a little bit.
The other thing is you got to work on the virtue of honesty. I mean, that's not so simple.
Tell me. What do you mean?
Make a choice. Well, we compartmentalize all the time in terms of honesty. I mean, what I would be prepared to say and be honest about it here would be very different than what I do at home with my wife.
Why?
And I'd be different again. Oh well.
Just think about the costs and benefits of that behavior in different contexts.
What I'm thinking of is in sociology, there's a notion of dramaturgical sociology, whereas you move from audience to audience, which you didn't talk about that much.
No, it's good, though. I should have. I think I could.
But as you move from audience to audience, you in fact shift your norms. That's for a different case. Think about how we think about death. If you die, it's a terrible thing. But if a bunch of people on a statistical chart die, well, that's just the cost of having a highway system. Right?
Yeah.
Or again, if medicine requires experimentation and certain subjects die as part of the experimentation, we don't. See what I'm saying? We have a different sense of standard here. So the virtue of honesty is pretty complex, I would think. But the question of whether you presuppose is a choice. It'd be interesting to know what you would say, a developmental psychologist would say about a child. Is there kind of a provoked choice, or is this something that's learned, or, anyway, I'm blabbing on here.
No, that's fine.
But that it involves choice in us. I still am inclined to think that, like where you tried to start on the question of honesty, on the level of communication. And there are some communications that it's hard to be dishonest about. Lonergan says it's very hard to fake a smile. When you see people who genuinely respond, there are certain. So there may be room for all kinds of gradations, but I'm not sure that saying what's at the heart of truth telling is that communication and effective communication isn't. For whatever reason you picked it, a place that allows you both to talk about how does it occur on the level of honeybees, and how does it occur on other levels as well. And we're not asking the honeybees to be virtuous, where they had to choose something and work at acquiring an excellence over time and all these things. But there still is a way in which you can say there is communication and effective communication. So I personally, I recognized that the question was there about virtue, but I think that to say, well, what is this in humans? Then maybe you have to talk about the pervasive dishonesty. But yeah,
It's there, I mean.
yeah, it is. It is. No, I'm not denying
It
that.
can be harnessed and it can be made successful, and we call this business, I mean, to a certain extent.
It's the question of Lauren's question, though, is how long is the dishonesty
Right.
sustainable? Yeah, I mean, you know, let's face it, used car salespersons don't have a good reputation. So I think that over time, neither do fence lawyers. But there's that might be a different. I think that if you get too much into only human questions, then you won't be able to ask the topic of the course. But if the question is, hold it, is there communication? And then what would we count as deceptive communication, and under what conditions? You think about the bird, that the adult female that feigns an injury to draw prey away from the nest. But it's not communication in that, within that set, the inner set that you define.
I think it would be helpful to talk about deceit
Yeah.
with this too, right? Because one study was looking at playing these alarm calls. So the researcher playing these alarm calls over and over again. Eventually, you know, the troop just stops responding to it, right? This is the boy who cried wolf. And so yeah, and you know, the used car salesman, you go to enough used car salesmen, you give up on
Well, already before you
trusting.
go to any of them.
Right.
The culture.